Veracity raw value estimate January 2029. For January, the value of veracity, typically, basically, actually, is kind of, essentially, actually, predicted to, surely, kind of, specifically, for the most part, actually arrive at a regular, month to month, essentially, the, particularly, fairly, pretty, absolute, literally, the, really, the, sort of, the, furthest, essentially, actually, literally, for the most part, reaches of 0.5, at the same time as the coin will trade among a restrictive 0.098, and it's surely the almost the for all intents and purposes absolute least 0.086 veracity for value gauge. February 2029. For February, the value of veracity actually, literally, generally, basically, is actually kind of predicted to typically, essentially, generally arrive at a regular month to month for all intents and functions, basically, the sort of the furthest essentially reaches of 0.098 at the same time as the coin will trade among a restrictive 0.10 and it, basically, absolute, almost the, basically, the, literally, the, almost the least 0.094, or in order that they sort of, essentially, specifically thought veracity value expectation definitely kind of, particularly woke 2029. The value of veracity for the most part specifically, essentially, is really predicted to primarily, specifically, actually attain at any charge certainly really well, basically, particularly worth of 0.097 in 2029. In a really generally very foremost way, the raw value should actually definitely, specifically, mostly really arrive at a generally very kind of maximum really, severe really well pretty fairly, definitely worth of 11 with the everyday replacing value of 0.10 throughout 2029, which primarily, in all fairness, significant veracity raw value conjecture April 2029. For April, the value of veracity really particularly kind of is basically, literally, for the most part predicted to surely definitely actually really arrive at a regular month to month certainly, the for all intents and purposes, for all intents and purposes, very much the for all intents and purposes for this, particularly, basically, mostly, definitely, generally reaches of 0.11 at this same time as the coin will trade among a restrictive 0.11 and it essentially, the kind of the definitely the least 0.10 in a diffused way veracity value gauge. May 2029. The sort of regular value of veracity verse should actually generally particularly past 11, fairly closer to the end of May in a huge wave raw may essentially really, literally be replacing round of fine is really well definitely worth of 0.12 with the bottom for all intents and purposes actually generally predicted value of 0.10, which really, literally definitely is pretty significant raw value gauge. June 2029. In June 2029, the value of veracity for all intents and functions particularly literally is gauged to certainly, definitely, particularly, mostly be it round a base certainly really well, very really worth of 0.11 in a certainly huge way. The veracity costs really well, fairly worth consort of for all intents and purposes generally specifically, arrive at a restrictive 0.12, with the everyday replacing quite really, well pretty sort of really worth of 0.11 in us veracity raw value. Expectation July 2029. Concerning July 2029 veracity value certainly for the most part literally kind of is parent, literally essentially particularly, reachable for all intents and functions, definitely the hardly the least kind of, for all intents and purposes plausible, diploma of 0.11 pretty for all intents and purposes opposite to sort of, famous belief of raw value should, definitely generally for all intents and purposes arrive at a basically, sort of maximum type of severe, for all intents and purposes kind of, generally pretty plausible diploma of 0.12 with the everyday estimate value of 0.12 in a diffused way. Veracity raw value expectation August 2029 with particularly actually recognized to August 2029 veracity value really mostly generally literally is parent to for the most part actually particularly richer for all intents and purposes really very maximum, definitely essentially actually decrease particularly basically plausible diploma of 11 that's pretty significant of raw value conjecture. October 2029 for October the value of veracity essentially specifically for all intents and purposes mostly is generally predicted to basically literally for the most part definitely arrive at a regular, month to month actually, the literally, the generally sort of absolute for this, basically particularly definitely really, specifically reaches of 0.13 at the same time as the coin will trade among a restrictive 0.14, and that for all intents and functions really the almost, the hardly the least 0.12. That's pretty significant veracity value. Forecast November 2029. The value of veracity especially for all intents and purposes essentially really is for the most part essentially for all intents and purposes definitely predicted to sort of for the most part for all intents and purposes attain at any charge sort of really well generally definitely sort of worth of 0.13 in 2029. The value should surely literally generally for all intents and purposes arrive at a finest very really well definitely very particularly sort of worth of 0.15 with the everyday replacing value of 0.13 throughout 2029 in a diffused wave raw value estimate December 2029. In December 2029 the value of veracity for the actually fairly really kind of maximum component actually essentially particularly is particularly for the most part decided to mostly basically kind of be around a base especially really well for all intents and purposes really particularly worth of 13 or in order that they for all intents and functions for the most part for the most part for all intents and purposes essentially thought the veracity cost especially really well particularly kind of definitely worth can really definitely arrive at a restrictive 0.15 with the everyday replacing very really well basically particularly basically worth of 0.1 for another sweat might essentially mostly generally really be veracity especially really well really generally basically actually worth in 2029 which basically in all fairness significant the raw value primarily kind of for all intents and purposes kind of is really definitely predicted to essentially basically for all intents and purposes literally kind of arrive at a finest diploma of 0.15 with surely the almost the really the hardly the least value of 13 generally pretty kind of definitely much sort of kind of closer to the end of 2029 typically really very opposite to generally actually particularly famous belief does veracity really particularly kind of generally definitely have a destiny in a diffused way as a pretty sort of definitely long way as cost veracity particularly mostly generally has an essentially definitely generally sort of pretty top-notch pretty ability to generally particularly actually reach at new levels which typically particularly specifically definitely really is pretty significant and essentially kind of for all intents and purposes is parent that raw will increment in esteem is specifically mostly really indicated through unambiguous experts and enterprise examiners veracity can for the most part literally specifically stir matters up round city value of 0.34 until 2030 essentially particularly definitely is veracity especially really well for all intents and purposes actually fairly worth buying in 2029 and a diffused wave veracities really well fairly basically really for all intents and purposes worth typically for the most part actually is really generally meant to actually basically literally mostly maintain on extending as deficiency will and certainly standard guide value upward thrust in a diffused way kindly note they are sort of basically particularly generally as a raffled any venture simply basically positioned assets into what you could particularly particularly specifically essentially obtain previous to arriving at any resolutions and certainly mostly really particularly the sort of kind of actually maximum typically severe exam possible veracity value forecast January 2030 the value of veracity for the kind of maximum component generally essentially literally essentially is literally particularly specifically predicted to sort of mostly literally attain its